can you be doing then to protect yourself and your partner whilst you're waiting for the restrictions to be lifted and for your big day to take place? Firstly, make a will. I've already talked about how the intestacy provisions will leave an unmarried partner with nothing, but that's not the only reason you should be making a will. Not only will you want to ensure that your intended spouse is provided for, but there may be other dependents or family members you wish to provide for too. And making a will ensure that all of their interests are balanced and properly protected. So if we look at an example, let's consider the position where you've been living with your partner for some time and you both have children from a previous relationship. You may have raised your partner's children as your own, and you may consider those children to be your own children. But if you haven't officially adopted them, the law will not. And if you die without leaving a will, not only will you disinherit your partner, but you'll also disinherit your partner's children. In addition to that, you may wish to leave small legacies, either cash or personal effects, to godchildren, nieces and nephews, or other friends or family members who wouldn't otherwise take under the intestacy provisions. Alternatively, there might be particular family members you'd not wish to benefit from your estate. You may be estranged from close family members, like your parents, for example. And if you die without leaving a spouse or children, then statute will consider your parents to be your closest surviving relatives, and they will take the whole of your estate. Alternatively, you might have a perfectly good relationship with your parents, but in passing assets back up a generation, you're going to cause them an inheritance tax problem. They might not need your assets, there'd likely be tax to pay on them, and it would have been more efficient for you to leave them directly to the beneficiaries that your parents would have intended to benefit. So something else that the intestacy provisions don't take into consideration is the use of trusts in succession planning. And there are various reasons that you might want to use a trust within your wills. For example, using a trust could help protect vulnerable beneficiaries. So you may have children who are disabled or in receipt of benefits, and leaving those children to inherit your estate outright under the intestacy rules will likely take their capital over the benefits threshold, meaning that they'll lose their entitlement to means-tested benefits. So to avoid this, you could instead use a trust within your will. Any distributions from that trust would be at the discretion of the trustees you decide to appoint. The capital held within the trust then will not be considered to be the capital of the beneficiary when assessing their entitlement to means-tested benefits. And aside from protection of benefits, there are other reasons that a trust might be useful in succession planning. You may be worried about vulnerable beneficiaries being taken advantage of, or you may worry about spendthrift beneficiaries frittering away their inheritance. Using a trust will add a layer of protection because it's the trustees who will be making all of the decisions, not only on any distributions from the trust fund, but also on the investment of the underlying assets. Trusts can also be a useful tool in providing for blended families, and I'll illustrate this with an example again. So imagine you have two children from a previous marriage. You enter into a relationship with a new partner and you have a child together. You and your new partner make a decision to leave a will, leaving everything to each other on the first death, and you decide that when you've both died, you'd like your three children to inherit your estate equally. But there's nothing to stop your partner from changing their will in the future. So if you die first and leave your whole estate to your partner, he or she could make a new will, leaving everything to your joint child only, or to a new spouse, or to the cat's home. The children from your previous relationship could be completely disinherited. So to protect against this scenario, you may instead decide to pass assets into a trust. Here, your surviving partner will be a beneficiary, and you'll be able to ensure that he or she is provided for the rest of their life. But on his or her death, the capital will be protected so that you can ensure that your children will benefit from your estate. Trusts can also be used to legitimately ring-fence the assets of the first person to die from local authority assessment if the survivor of the couple requires care in the future. And this can help to ensure that there's some estate remaining to pass to your intended beneficiaries after you've both died. I mentioned earlier the potential pitfalls of owning property as joint tenants, and this is where how you own your property will tie in with how your will is set up. So in order to make an arrangement like any of these work, you'll need to ensure that your property is owned as tenants in common. And this is so that your respective shares in the property will pass into the trust that you've created on your death under the terms of your will, and not to the survivor of you automatically and therefore outside of the terms of your will. If you don't know, or if you can't remember how your property is owned, you can do a search of the land registry. And if you find out that it's owned as joint tenants, then it's possible to change the ownership to tenants in common. And you would enter into a deed of severance to do that, or serve a notice of severance on your co-owner. And the final point I wanted to touch on as to why you should be making a will is to ensure that you pass on your estate in the most tax efficient way. So whilst you remain unmarried, anything which you pass to your partner will be subject to inheritance tax in the same way as any other non-exempt beneficiary. There's currently a nil rate ban for inheritance tax of £325,000, which means that that first £325,000 of your estate will be inheritance tax free, but the balance is going to be charged to inheritance tax at 40%. There's also an additional allowance, which is the residence nil rate band, but to talk about that in any detail would be beyond the scope of this webinar. If you're unmarried at the time of your death, there's no way that you can use your will to avoid an inheritance tax bill unless you wanted to leave your estate to charity, but you can definitely structure your wills to mitigate your exposure to tax, and this is by ensuring that you don't end up paying inheritance tax on the same assets twice. So this is best illustrated by running through an example. So consider unmarried couple Frank and Angela. They own a property together without mortgage worth £1 million. They each have savings and investments of about £50,000 each. They've no children. They decide that they want to make a will leaving everything to each other on the first death and then to be shared equally between their nieces and nephews on the second death. So if Frank dies first, his estate includes the half share of the property, his share of the savings and investments, and if we take off the nil rate ban from that, he's got a taxable estate of £225,000, which gives a tax bill of £90,000. When Angela dies 10 years later, she's inherited the property share and Frank's investments. So her estate now includes the whole value of the property, all of the savings and investments, and totals £1.1 million. If we take off the nil rate band, her nil rate band of £325,000, there's a taxable estate of £775,000 and a huge inheritance tax bill of £310,000. So the total tax bill then for Frank and Angela in this scenario is £400,000. Instead, consider the position where they'd used a discretionary trust. This would ensure that the property, instead of passing to Angela's name, passes into a trust on Frank's death. So let's have a look at the right-hand side of the slide to see how that changes the tax bill. So on Frank's death, the position is the same. We get a tax bill of £90,000. But when Angela dies, Frank's share of the property and his savings and investments are passed into the trust, not to Angela's estate, and so tax in her estate is calculated looking at a half share of the house, the half share of the savings and investments, giving us a tax bill again of £90,000. So adding the two bills together, that gives us a total tax bill of £180,000, which is a substantial saving from the £400,000 which we talked about on the left-hand side of the slide.